You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Gemma here from True Crime Conversations, and today you'll be hearing part 2 of the Extraordinary Stories deep dive into the disappearance of Peng Shuai. In this episode, we'll learn more about the Chinese propaganda machine and how it worked to convince the world of Peng Shuai's safety whilst censoring her story. We'll be back next week with brand new True Crime Conversations. But keep your eyes and ears peeled on Monday for a final drop of part 3 in this series before we return to regular programming next Thursday.
We'll be bringing you all the action from Rod Laver Arena, all of the colour, all of the excitement of day one of Australian Open 2022.
It's the 29th of January 2022. Melbourne Park is abuzz with the thrum of fans and cameras as the world's best tennis players do battle in searing conditions. Tonight, it's the women's final, and spectators are anxiously anticipating Ash Barty's showdown against America's Danielle Collins. It's been 2 years since the Australian Open was able to open its gates to the public. And while morale is high ahead of an Aussie's chance to take home glory, this year, the Grand Slam tennis tournament is under a cloud of controversy.
Tennis star Novak Djokovic has been cleared to compete in the Australian Open. The Serbian player revealed in an Instagram post that he's on his way down under with an exemption permission. That's despite a vaccine mandate in place for the tournament and the crowds. He has always refused to confirm his immunisation status.
If he's not going to get vaccinated, he needs to do what everyone else is doing and stay home.
Away from centre court and tied up in court. It's the last place Novak Djokovic wanted to be on the eve of the Australian Open.
The orders of the court are: 1, the amended application be dismissed with costs.
The Migration Act requires him to be deported from Australia as soon as reasonably practicable.
But in one corner of Melbourne Park, a much quieter protest is afoot. Over the last few days, spectators have been seen dotted around the tournament grounds in white t-shirts with bold black text that reads, "Where is Peng Shuai?" It's been nearly 3 months since Peng Shuai accused a former senior Chinese government official of sexual assault. The movement for her freedom has stretched far and wide, and today, it's on the doorstep of Rod Laver Arena. Although the cause had made headlines previously, Tennis Australia asks protesters to remove their shirts or leave.
The organisers of the Australian Open at tennis are facing fresh criticism for clamping down on banners and t-shirts that display support for the Chinese player Peng Shuai.
But the grassroots campaign, originally organised amongst Australian and Chinese uni students, will see some 1,000 people seated inside Rod Laver Arena on one of the biggest nights of the tennis calendar, donning their t-shirts with a simple message that wasn't going away anytime soon.
We started a GoFundMe. We wanted to raise $5,000 to try and print as many t-shirts as possible that basically said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" We were like, if they're going to try to ban them from the grounds, we're going to print out 1,000 and we'll dare them to evict 1,000 people at the grand final wearing these shirts. This was the kind of idea. We wanted to raise the stakes. We wanted to make things hard for Tennis Australia.
The timing really couldn't be better for those of us who care about the story, and the timing really couldn't be worse for Chinese officials who wanted to go away.
For 3 long weeks in November 2021, tennis stars and fans, news organisations and human rights advocates the world over had one question: where is Peng Shuai? After the 35-year-old tennis player and Grand Slam double star was feared caught up in another of China's mysterious forced disappearances.
Of course, I feel that the international community needs to be doing more to speak up for Peng Shuai. It's really sad that, the Winter Olympics occurred and people were speaking about Peng Shuai to a certain extent, and then, there was this forced confession-style interview she gave with French media where she was, speaking but with a Chinese government official present in the room. It was almost metaphorically a gun to her head.
In the aftermath of a Weibo post detailing allegations of sexual assault against one of China's top political figures, concerns for her freedom were escalating swiftly. As we began to learn more about the complex political and social climate Peng Shuai was operating within, pressure from the international community would reach breaking point as Beijing scrambled to convince us Peng Shuai was free.
Everybody was very curious of the details. It was a story of sexual assault, but there are also details about how she couldn't enter the compound where he lives. It really says, the kind of control and protection afforded to those people that, a regular person would never be able to get in touch with that kind of high-level official, because the top officials are so protected.
On this episode, we'll learn more about the Chinese propaganda machine and how it's working to convince its people of Peng's safety while censoring her story.
China's general modus operandi with stories like this is that, ride the storm and people will stop talking about it in a couple of weeks.
But what happens when the rest of the world doesn't buy it? And how can we ever really know Peng Shuai is safe?
The way the world works these days, you hear a story, you think it's bad for 24 hours, and then the next thing comes up, whether that be more COVID or Ukraine or whatever it may be going on at the time. And the news cycle is so quick that people tend to care about something for 24 hours and then lose focus. And for us, this just wasn't a story that we could afford to put in, last year's news stories category. This is a woman whose liberty, as far as we know, has been taken away. And why was it taken away? Because she wanted to call someone out for sexual assault?
I'm Emma Gillespie, and this is Extraordinary Stories, the disappearance of Peng Shuai. On the 2nd of November 2021, Peng Shuai posted on the Chinese social media platform Weibo detailing an alleged affair and rape. In the weeks that followed, she was not seen or heard from, as many grew concerned she might have disappeared completely, for good. Tom Steinford is a journalist and presenter with Channel 9's 60 Minutes. He said it was important to him and his team that they make sure the story of Peng Shuai didn't fade into the background. Tom wanted to hold China to account.
For us, there were still so many unanswered questions. Something about it just stinks. It really does. The more you dig, the more it stinks. And so for us, it was a case of wanting to keep the pressure on China. Their dream is that no one asks them questions. It's the system they've set up in their own country. No one there dares ask any questions of the leaders and the regime.
But the international community wanted answers, and calls for them were only getting louder. Before we would see that Peng Shuai was okay, China wanted us to read about it, when on the 17th of November, the Women's Tennis Association received an email, supposedly penned by Peng Shuai. No one has been able to confirm if it was written by the tennis star, and it was released by Chinese state-run media. The intended audience of this email was already sceptical, but concern only intensified after a retraction of Peng Shuai's assault allegations came within that email. It read,
"Hello everyone, this is Peng Shuai. Regarding the recent news released on the official website of the WTA, the content has not been confirmed or verified by myself, and it was released without my consent. The news in that release, including the allegation of sexual assault, is not true. I'm not missing, nor am I unsafe. I've just been resting at home and everything is fine. Thank you again for caring about me. If the WTA publishes any more news about me, please verify it with me and release it with my consent. As a professional tennis player, I thank you for all your companionship and consideration. I hope to promote Chinese tennis with you all if I have the chance in the future. I hope Chinese tennis will become better and better. Once again, thank you for your consideration."
There was an alleged email sent by Peng Shuai to the WTA saying, "I'm fine, don't worry about me," things like that.
That's Yachu Wang again. You heard from her last episode.
I write and research about human rights issues pertaining to China, not just within China. It's also, how the Chinese government is affecting human rights around the globe, given, the size of the country and the power of the government. So the email looks so not real. So people were like question, like, this doesn't look real at all. One hand, I would say, this, as somebody who studies human rights in China, this has been practiced many times. The machine has a way of doing this, faking things, making people say what they want to say. But at the same time, like, they don't even do a good job. In a way, I would say, they feel so brazen. They can just fake stuff without making much an effort to look real.
What this has done has made them uncomfortable because people overseas are shining a light on what really is happening there day to day. I mean, we all know there are massive human rights issues in China, but this personalizes it. And also, if this is happening to a woman of such a high profile, high standing, imagine what is happening to people that don't have a platform to perhaps voice their grievances and what has happened to them and how they've been treated and how they have been abused.
Tom Steinford from Channel 9's 60 Minutes says China was dealing with their response to this story on two fronts. One at home in China, where they were able to control the narrative through censorship. But the other wasn't so easy to get a hold over.
What has captured so much international attention, the fact that, well, if this can happen to a woman as prominent as Peng Shuai, what's going on there behind the scenes that we don't know about? And so China gets very uncomfortable when people start looking closely at the reality of what life is like in China. They try and portray it as this, developing nation and, yep, we're world leaders on so many fronts. Well, you're certainly not on human rights. And that is the big issue, that we all want to do business with China and import products from there and, live the good life when it comes to the benefits of China's prosperity. But you can't then turn a blind eye on the other front and say, oh, yeah, we'll take all the good and we'll ignore the bad. I'm sorry, that's just morally unacceptable.
Amidst that growing international pressure and after what felt like a lifetime of waiting, a Chinese state-run media outlet released a video of the 35-year-old dining at a restaurant in Beijing. The video shows Peng Shuai enjoying a weekend lunch at Beijing's Yibin Guest House, a popular restaurant where customers regularly have to queue for a table. It's noisy and it's busy, and it's the place that was likely handpicked by Beijing officials to reveal Peng Shuai's whereabouts to the world. What's interesting about the short clip is that during it, Peng and her guests mention the date out loud on more than one occasion. They mention it 5 times, to be exact. However dubious the international community remained, it's largely thanks to the attention this story had commanded around the world that we even got that video, or any proof that Peng might be, quote-unquote, okay.
The reason the government had to do the international propaganda was because they cannot censor. But inside the country, they can censor, so they just stopped the discussion. She reappeared, first in a video that she was having dinner with some friends. Later, she attended a public tennis event. I wasn't surprised at all, because this happened before to many human rights activists, lawyers, business people who somehow got into bad blood with the Chinese government for criticizing government or somehow made the Chinese government unhappy. When Peng Shuai re-emerged in those videos, I just felt this fit into the old pattern of the government first silence critics, then make them reappear to make some forced confession, to say whatever the government wants them to say.
Despite the obvious human rights concerns surrounding Peng Shuai's detainment, Ya-Chu thinks that there's another universal theme responsible for capturing our imaginations in such a way.
I would say, I'm pleasantly surprised that people are paying attention to this case outside of China. I think it's tied to, it's sports. People care about sports. That's something that is popular.
There's something very uncomfortable, mysterious, unnatural about the way that this is playing out. And I think people are just almost like a car crash. You can't look away because it's horrible. But what on earth is going on there kind of thing.
Whatever reason people were drawn to this story, it was only gaining greater momentum by the day. All eyes were on China's next move.
There's nothing natural or normal about the way that she's been paraded around.
As dodgy as that video of Peng in the restaurant may have seemed, it was the proof of life many tennis players were anxiously awaiting.
We can't forget about it. We have to use our platforms as athletes, and I think that was, I think we're obligated to do that. We're obligated to speak up and, get to the root of what's happening and why it's happening.
But Yachu Wang says there's nothing in the propaganda videos that surprised her. While the international community watched on, many were left wondering how those within mainland China could believe this video, the latest in the Peng Shuai narrative. But as Yachu explains, the Chinese government doesn't need to convince them, because the people that live there will never see this video.
Well, actually, people inside China don't know those staged videos, because those staged videos where she was having dinner were posted on Twitter. She attending the tennis events, her phone calls, they were not broadcasted inside the country. Inside the country, her story was censored. So it was appeared for 30 minutes on Weibo. Then it was gone. You cannot discuss about her anymore. So all that propaganda was for the external, for the international audience. So for people in China, she only existed, her story only existed for 30 minutes. So, but eventually her case died down because the censorship was very, very stringent.
What came after that video of Peng Shuai in the restaurant were more attempts to convince global onlookers that there was nothing to see here. The morning after that restaurant video, state media released footage of Peng at a junior tennis tournament at the National Tennis Centre in the 2008 Olympic zone. At every appearance, she is flanked by government officials.
It becomes this case of almost wanting to see what they'll say next. What ridiculous lie will China come up with next to try and basically make this story disappear? If they were serious, they would let Peng Shuai fly to London, to Switzerland, to America, whatever it may be, and with no Chinese officials present, let her sit in a room with some foreign authorities, with foreign journalists, whatever it may be, and let her answer questions freely without coercion, intimidation.
Despite a feeling of helplessness from many in and outside of China, there was one key stakeholder in the Peng Shuai narrative willing to take a stand. One that would send a definitive message to China declaring that they would not be distracted by propaganda and that the world was not ready to turn its back on this story. The Women's Tennis Association.
The Women's Tennis Association pulling $1 billion in business out of China out of concern for Peng Shuai.
Until such time that we can get comfort that she is truly free from any type of coercion or intimidation or censorship, this is something we can't walk away from. If we walk away from this, we're basically telling the world that not addressing sexual assault with the respect and seriousness it requires is okay.
In the immediate aftermath of that video, as it went viral everywhere except China, WTA Chief Executive Steve Simon issued a statement.
I'm glad to see the videos released by China's state-run media that appear to show Peng Shuai at a restaurant in Beijing. While it is positive to see her, it remains unclear if she is free and able to make decisions and take actions on her own without coercion or external interference. This video alone is insufficient. As I have stated from the beginning, I remain concerned about Peng Shuai's health and safety, and that the allegation of sexual assault is being censored and swept under the rug. I have been clear about what needs to happen, and our relationship with China is at a crossroads.
Reading between the lines of Steve Simon's statement lies a threat. One to pull all of its tournaments out of China. A move that would cost both China and the WTA millions. But even the United Nations wanted proof Peng was safe, and someone needed to do something.
So the WTA has basically said, we're not taking tournaments back to China until you come clean about what has happened to Peng Shuai. That's going to cost them tens of millions of dollars. There's no doubt about that. They lose all these tour events. Not only that, they lose sponsorship in China. There's a lot of money that comes from China.
It was a stand Tom Steinfurt says other similar organisations weren't willing to take.
Contrast that to perhaps the NBA, which has had similar issues of leadership within some of the clubs in the NBA, the basketball league in America, of different people calling out China and China saying, hang on, you do that, we'll pull the funding. So what did the NBA do? They told people to shut up. They banned signs at games and said, no, we're not a place where we're going to be criticising China because, well, let's be honest, we kind of need the money.
We would like and demand that a transparent and full investigation of these allegations is made with no censorship associated with this at all. There are a lot of things we don't agree with that happen in this world. If we are able, and maybe this is one of those instances in which we're able to make somebody do the right thing, then I think if we have any integrity at all, and there was any integrity in the request that we made, if it's done and done to the appropriate satisfactions, then yes, we would continue. And I think you should. You can't make these statements and then take your toys and run away and you're not going to play anymore. You know, if it doesn't happen, as I've said, we are prepared to move on and deal with the challenges that will come with that, and they will be significant. But we are steadfast in that approach, and I don't see that changing.
By now, the question of where Peng Shuai was specifically had sort of been answered. We'd seen her in multiple Chinese state-run media ops. We knew she was in Beijing, most likely. But we didn't know if she was in police custody, if she was being detained, what was going on behind closed doors, or what she'd been instructed by the Chinese Communist Party to say and do.
She had caused such embarrassment to the Chinese government, and she lives in China. She's not free.
It would still be another month before we'd hear from Peng herself. Then, on the 19th of December, the world watched on in shock as they heard this alarming retraction from a woman at the centre of what we can't forget are sexual assault allegations.
I want to emphasize one thing that is very important, that I have never spoken or written about anyone sexually assaulting me.
Despite Peng Shuai now denying Zhang Gaoli had wronged her in any way and denying that very first Weibo post in November 2021, the international community just didn't believe the words she was saying. And neither did the tennis world.
The WTA, on the other hand, has said, no, that's it. We are not going to turn a blind eye to these appalling instances of abuse and human rights violations. So credit to them. I think in terms of would this have got as much attention if the WTA didn't stand up? I think what's heartening is that there seems to be more awareness around the world now of the reality of day-to-day life in China. And I think it's been a bit of a slow burn in terms of people waking up to what's happening there. But, you know, this is becoming quite clear now.
The WTA suspending tournaments in China was the largest scale protest against the CCP that we'd seen throughout this whole saga. But smaller scale protests were beginning to pop up around the world too, even right here in our own backyard. Drew Pavlou is an Australian human rights activist and hopeful independent politician. Drew's been working to raise awareness of Peng Shuai's plight.
Peng Shuai may not have been a household name in the West prior to this terrible incident, but she certainly was a household name in China. She was a #1 doubles player in the world. The idea that this could happen to, you know, this major star in the year 2022 in a country that is as powerful and as wealthy as China is just so shocking. It really underscores the abuses of powerful men.
But while many of us felt helpless, Drew saw an opportunity, and he hatched a plan that involved the Australian Open and some white T-shirts. Actually, lots of white T-shirts.
We're very passionate about these issues, human rights in China, women's rights in China, and we just organised for these activists to go out to the Australian Open and wear these shirts. We're working with an artist in Melbourne who wants to remain confidential because she's got family in China, and, family members get persecuted by this government when you speak against them. And we had these activists go out to the Australian Open and, there was no ruckus being caused. There was no disruption to play or anything. These people were just wearing shirts that said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" A very simple statement.
Where better to command the attention of tennis's biggest stars, fans and decision makers than at the Australian Open? On top of the thousands of spectators on the ground, the broadcast of the finals of this Grand Slam commands audiences into the millions. And that's just who's watching here in Australia. Drew's goal? A silent protest of 1,000 spectators begging a question Tennis Australia and the world watching on from their living rooms couldn't ignore. Where is Peng Shuai? But when the protesters arrived at Melbourne Park, they were told they'd need to take their shirts off. They were asked to leave.
And then, quite extraordinarily, the security, I guess they had been briefed prior to the games and basically been told people will try and speak up for Peng Shuai, make sure to go against that, make sure to shut that down. We think they must have been briefed because, you couldn't have even, 99% of people who walked past this shirt wouldn't have even known who Peng Shuai was. Most people wouldn't have even had a clue of what these activists were silently protesting, and yet they set security on them. So we think they had to have been briefed. And it turns out the Australian Open has really, really extensive financial ties with Chinese sponsors to the tune of tens of millions of dollars every single year. A Chinese state-owned liquor company is one of their major courtside sponsors, and every time a player wins, their branding and imagery is flashed across the stadiums. So it's very clear, I think, that Tennis Australia made a commercial decision. They wanted to basically silence criticism of the Chinese government and silence any mention of human rights abuses in China at the Australian Open because they didn't want to lose commercial ties to China.
With focus pulled in other directions since Peng Shuai's disappearance, the news cycle had been dominated by the spread of the COVID Omicron variant, Novak Djokovic's vaccine visa controversy. Had momentum been lost for Peng Shuai?
I imagined myself in her shoes, and in that way, it's a little bit scary.
So you'd like her to take the shirt off? Can you just show us the shirt? What do you suggest she wear? This, I can't take my shirt off.
Then I have to take the one off here as well, yeah.
If we can see, People's Republic of China flags all over the court, I think it's only natural that we can ask about a missing woman.
Tennis Australia did eventually backflip on their stance, and the T-shirts were allowed to be worn. While the rest of us sitting at home wouldn't be shown anyone in the crowd wearing them, they still played an important role.
They basically backed down, and thank God they did. And we got 1,000 shirts out there, and it's incredible what happened. And, we don't have a professional team. We didn't have any media experience or training, really. We just kind of did this, bunch of uni students and activists, and it's incredible how huge it became, and just so happy that Peng Shuai wasn't forgotten.
Key stakeholders in the West and around the world began to rally around the plight of Peng Shuai's freedom more and more. But the Winter Olympics were just around the corner. The Beijing Winter Olympics. The very games that Peng's accused rapist, Zhang Gaoli, helped facilitate. And there was one question that loomed large still. What happens when one of the largest sporting bodies in the world is accused of silencing a sexual assault survivor?
So I think that was the part that surprised me, that the IOC was willing to participate in the government's propaganda apparatus to, paint a picture of Peng Shuai being free. They chose to be complicit in the Chinese government's censorship and propaganda.
Next time on Extraordinary Stories, the final instalment in the disappearance of Peng Shuai, the International Olympic Committee and the Chinese Communist Party. Strange bedfellows or something more sinister? Plus, Peng Shuai fronts Western media for the first time since her Weibo post. And what does her story of a tennis star besmirched by her home government and forced into retirement tell us about a broader movement within mainland China? What of their Me Too movement? Thank you for listening to this episode of Extraordinary Stories. It was written and produced by me, Emma Gillespie, with Callie Borg. Audio production is by Madeline Joannou. See you next time.